Tortorich.
Thank you. There's too many gadgets up here, but thank you, Helen. First of all, I want to recognize Helen and her crew. I have watched Helen being frustrated over the last couple of years trying to make this convention happen. And as she said, as early as 2 weeks ago, it was still up in the air. And I'm amazed that she's still coherent and functioning as well as she is. So thank you. I also want to thank and recognize the Mormon Battalion Association for all of their recent research. I've been a member of various Mormon Battalion associations for many years, and they kind of all went defunct, but the modern group are doing some amazing new research. And Laura Anderson, I want to particularly recognize for being a great help for me. I'm amazed at the speakers that we've had this week because so many of them have been setting the stage for what I am going to be talking about. Dr. Armstead, who talked about manifest destiny, that fits right into what I'm talking about. And I'm so happy for this because, as he said, you can't deal with this stuff in isolation. Everything is connected to everything else. And I don't have enough time today to talk about everything I would like to talk about. And so I'm going to have to stick with my notes. Otherwise, I'm going to be all over the place. 1846 was a key year. There were so many things happening in this country in 1846. Manifest destiny was going on. We had the expansionist movement going on. President Polk wanted to own the country from ocean to ocean, as well as some of the other prominent leaders. We had the Donner Party getting ready to go. And we had the great Mormon migration waiting to go. And a lot of this was precipitated and related to the American-Mexican War. That war that was to be over the southern boundary of Texas, and also on the other front, on the other side of the continent, in California, where the Californios didn't want those Americans coming in and threatening their way of life. And so they wanted them out. And we also had the Oregon Territory being settled, as Dr. Armstead said. And in 1846, we finally signed an agreement with Great Britain on that joint occupancy, and we became the owners of the Oregon Territory. All the rest of that, below the Oregon Territories, of course, was Mexican land. Let me first define, if I can get this right here. Okay, I want to define for this talk what we mean by the California Trail, because I'm going to refer to it, and I call this the mini Mormon migration. And the California Trail, of course, was an offshoot of the Oregon Trail of 1843 through 1848. And of course, it was that trail. I knew I'd do that. It was that trail that started Independence and went all the way over to Oregon City. 1841 was the Bidwell-Bartleson Party when they created the California Cutoff. And of course, it was 1844 when it was the Murphy-Stephen-Townsend Party that brought the first wagons over the Truckee River route, and guided by Chief Truckee. Now, I didn't hear the final Winnemucca story, but Chief Truckee was the grandfather, I think, of Sarah Winnemucca. And he was the one that engaged them. And Truckee in Paiute means okay. So what they were saying to him is, this is the way to go, and he was going Truckee, Truckee. And so he should be men called Chief Okay. And of course that name Truckee, we still maintain that name today. Okay. All of this began really with the Mormon migration, which we all know about, began with the 1846, let me back here, I got everything. In June 27th, 1844, the founder and beloved president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith, and his brother Hiram were killed by an angry mob in the Carthage jail in Illinois. These murders were the continuation of the persistent persecutions of the long-hated Mormon people by non-Mormon Americans. After this event, the persecutions against the Mormons escalated, with farmlands being destroyed, barns and homes being burned. The killing of Joseph Smith fragmented the church and the leadership and began many debates of who would become the leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. At that time, Brigham Young was president of the Quorum of 12, and he would be second in command and eventually take over the leadership of the church. Other fragments of the church went off in different directions. By the end of September of 1845, it was clear that the saints would have to leave their farms and homes around Nauvoo and go to the Rocky Mountains. This was a prophecy of Joseph Smith that someday the saints would all go to the Rocky Mountains. Brigham Young was attempting to fulfill that prophecy, and he knew that the destination would be the Salt Lake Valley. But he wasn't really sharing the Salt Lake Valley because he was trying to fulfill the promise of Joseph Smith. Now, how did Brigham Young know to go to the Salt Lake Valley? Because he had the reports of John C. Fremont of his 1842 and 1843-44 expeditions. And he described the Salt Lake Valley in great detail. And Brigham Young knew that's where they wanted to go. They were in foreign country, but they could practice their theocracy without American influence. So in January 4th of 1846, the first group of saints crossed at times the frozen Mississippi River into Iowa with their very difficult trek towards what was now Omaha, Nebraska. Here they would build winter village they called winter quarters. On that very same day, a young elder in the church by the name of Sam Brannan, one of my not-so-favorite scoundrels, chartered a ship called the Brooklyn, and with 238 men, women, children, live animals, printing press, and large collections of tools, sailed out of the New York harbor for their destination, being the Mexican province of California. Brannan had a dream that California would be the Zion for the church. Brannan and a few others had that idea, but that wasn't Brigham Young's idea. From the beginning of their Mormon migration, Brigham Young sent his nephew, Elder Jesse Little, to Washington, D.C. to help seek assistance in their exodus from the United States. The war between the United States and Mexico was declared on May 13, 1846. And in June of 1846, the Mormons, exhausted and weary from their winter journey crossing Iowa, paused near as they were approaching the Missouri River at a location about 130 miles east that they named Mount Pisgah. It was here that U.S. Army Captain James Brown brought an answer to Young requesting for help from the United States. President Polk requested that 500 men from the migration be enlisted into the Army. Needing the money from the military pay to support their migration, Brigham Young encouraged this enlistment. This did not set well with any of them, any of the Mormons. This was just an American plot to get their best men killed off in war. But Brigham Young was eloquent in his talking to the people. And he told them that this is the first time the United States has ever asked for their help. And they were, after all, the Mormons were American citizens. And this is an opportunity for them to show the American people they are hardworking, dedicated, honest citizens. He also went on to tell them that they would do this not only for their country, they would do it for their church, their family, and their Lord. Here is what Daniel Tyler wrote about what Brigham Young said to encourage the enlistment. President Young encouraged the men by assuring them that their families should be cared for, that their should fare as well as his did, and that he would see that they were helped along. He also predicted that no one of these who might enlist will fall at the hands of the nation's foe, that the only fighting would be with the wild beast. Wow, to predict that nobody would die in battle. So men did reluctantly enlist. By the end of July, Captain Allen, who would be promoted to colonel, had compiled a list of Mormon volunteers that would take on the identity of the Mormon battalion. They were allowed to select their own officers. The count was thus: 22 officers, 474 enlisted, for a total of 496. The battalion organized themselves into 5 companies of 100. Each company was allowed 4 laundresses for a total of 20 laundresses to go along. Now, some of these men who were enlisting had families, and so they had no one to care for their families. So about 34 women and 44 children were allowed to go along with the Army, to a tune about 78. The battalion was dispatched to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and inducted in the U.S. Army under the command of General Stephen Watts Kearny to go to California to fight the Mexicans. After Mount Pisgah business was over, the Mormon migration reached the Missouri River. They stopped at this location that they would call Canesville, which is now Council Bluffs. The Mormon migration halted there as it was too late in the season to continue on to the Salt Lake Valley. They planned to continue their migration in the spring of 1847. Canesville would be a location of grand encampment where eventually some 15,000 Mormons would spend that winter. Brigham Young took about 6,000 across the Missouri to build the town of Winter Quarters, which is just north of Omaha. In August 13 of 1846, the U.S. Army of the West, including the Mormon battalions and the extra wives and children, started their march towards California. Kearny was ordered to lead the Army of the West by way of the Santa Fe Trail. He was charged to take command of the town of Santa Fe, which he did, and then proceeded on to California to take it for the United States. Santa Fe was uneventful with no fighting. As the Mormon battalion, along with the Army, was approaching Santa Fe, Kearny called them up, "Hurry up, come on up, you need to join us because we're going to engage the Mexicans." When they got to Santa Fe, the Mexican army had already retreated to Chihuahua to join up with Santa Anna to fight Zach Taylor on the southern border of Texas. So there was no battle in Santa Fe. So part of Brigham Young's prophecy came true. Just before and after Santa Fe, the Mormon battalion at different times would send 3 different groups of ill and fatigued members, along with wives and all the children, to Fort Pueblo, which is Colorado, for the winter. And they would be known as the sick detachments. This reduced the battalion numbers to 335 men and 5 women. Under the command of Colonel Cook, the battalion's job was to build a wagon road, a military wagon road to California. This would be a very hard, rigorous trip. They not only had to build this wagon road, but they had to carry their musket and their accoutrements along with them, and they were walking. Rations were very, very low, and they were in tatters by the time they reached California. They arrived in California after this horrendously difficult journey in January 29th, 1847. Upon their arrival in Southern California, they found war in California was over as of January 8th, 1847. Brigham Young's bold prophecy that no man would die in battle was fulfilled. The Mormon Battalion members were discharged from the U.S. Army in July of 1847 and were left to their own resources. The U.S. Army discharged them, said, "Thank you for your service, see you around." And here they were in Mexican territory, and they weren't even sure at that time where the destination would be, where the Saints would finally settle in the Salt Lake Valley. Now let's back up a year. In July 31st of 1846, the ship Brooklyn sailed into San Francisco Bay and dropped anchor into Yerba Buena Cove. Yerba Buena was the name of the small Mexican town before it was known as San Francisco. Brannan soon took up the business of establishing a Mormon settlement that more than doubled the population of that small Mexican community. He immediately started laying out city streets in a grid, and he also started buying up land. And he became actually quite wealthy from this endeavor. He sent a group of men up the San Joaquin River to start farming in a little place they called New Hope, and it's near Ripon, California, if you're familiar with that area. The other well-known event of 1846-47 was the Donner Tragedy. What is not well known is that the Mormon family of Thomas Rhodes, with permission for Brigham Young with 12 wagons and 38 members, came to California over the Truckee River route. a month ahead of the Donner Party. The Rhodes Party would be the second Mormon wagon train to migrate to California. The first Mormons to use the California Trail going west might have been William Bede Ide. Ide was not part of the Mormon migration, but set out on his own for Oregon. At Fort Hall, he was convinced that the California was a better choice and followed that California Trail, that California cutoff. Now, many of you may be familiar with Ide Adobe up near Redding, and also William Ide participated in the Bear Flag Revolt, which is a whole other story. In April of 1847, now remember 1846-47 was when the Donners were trapped in the mountains, that disastrous experience. April of 1847, Sam Brannan, joined by 2 other men, headed east over the Truckee River route with the purpose of finding Brigham Young and try to convince Young to bring the Saints to California to set up the Zion. These 3 men would be the first Mormons to travel the California Trail via the Truckee River route going east. Brannan did not really meet Brigham. Brannan did finally meet Brigham Young on the Green River. Brannan pleaded his case for the Saints to continue to California with no avail. Brigham Young ordered Brannan to return to California. Not trusting Brannan, Brigham was smart here, he sent Captain Brown with Brannan, and Captain Brown was the one who was in charge of the sick detachments that followed in behind Brigham Young's vanguard group that went into the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. Which I just said. All right, back to July and the Mormon Battalion. Upon discharge, the Mormon Battalion members broke into several groups. Now I'm going to throw out some numbers at you that were given by Nick out of Ricketts' book. I forgot her name. Norma Ricketts' book. Some of these numbers may be changing with the greatest research that the Mormon Battalion Association is presently doing. Some of these numbers now are flexing because they're getting a lot better documentation. But we'll go with these numbers. 79 men were re-enlisted in the Army for another 6 months, and these would be called the Mormon Volunteers. Several men returned by way of they came on the journey to winter quarters. Some chose to follow the old Spanish Trail by chance to meet up with Brigham Young's migration as they entered the Salt Lake Valley. One broke off to follow the El Camino Real, the Mission Highway, because they heard about Brannan's Mormon settlement in San Francisco. Now remember, this is a year after Brannan had settled in Yerba Buena. So word got out that settlement was there. The bulk of the discharge members, about 200 or so, went north through Central California to Sutters Fort. Okay. While traveling the Truckee River route, the Mormon battalions went to Sutters Fort, they got supplied from John Sutter, and they headed over the Truckee River route, hoping to find Brigham Young wherever on the migration. They encountered the returning Brannan as messenger from Brigham Young. About a day behind was Captain Brown with the official orders. They were told that the Salt Lake Valley was to be a destination of the future home of the Saints. They stated that the discharged battalion members go back to California, that times in the Salt Lake Valley would be difficult, and work for a year and earn money, and then in the following year come to the Salt Lake Valley. Those with adequate provisions continued on.
with about half of those group returning to California, and 104 continued on to the Salt Lake Valley, and some even went all the way to winter quarters where their family was. This would be the first mini Mormon migration from California east on the California Trail on the way to the Salt Lake Valley. The fifth group of Mormons to use the California Trail after Ides, Rhodes, Brannan, and Brown. Many of the discharged members found in Northern California, found work in Northern California with John Sutter. Sutter sent 6 Mormon men to work for James Marshall to build a sawmill in Coloma along the South Fork of the American River. These men were Henry Bigler, Azariah Smith, Alexander Stevens, James Brown, William Johnston, John Strum, and William Berger. I'm getting double vision here. I think my battery's running low. These men were the first eyewitnesses when Marshall discovered gold in the tail race on January 24th, 1848. James Marshall always declared he discovered gold on January the 19th. But William Bigler's journal documented that it was on January 24th that gold was actually discovered. So here's another impact that this Mormon group is making on not only California, but on the United States. One of the things that I failed to mention is why this all fascinates me is because none of this history has ever appeared in any California textbook. And here these people had a significant impact and an significant influence, and you never read it as a student in the schools. And I hated history growing up, and I wish I had Jill as my history teacher. Okay, here's what Henry Bigler wrote on Sunday, April 9th, 1848. Pretty much all the boys came together to talk about matters of things in regard to making arrangements for going to the Great Salt Lake, and came to some understanding that we would make the start. The decision was made that all be ready by the 1st of June, except 8 who were ready and expected to start with an express the next Saturday, though I believe to the States. We don't know what happened to that 8. It was further decided that we would send out a few men as pioneers before that time to pioneer a route across the Sierra Nevada, and if possible find a nearer route than to go the Truckee River route, thus shun the crossing the very deep and rapid Truckee River 27 times. We were informed by Mr. Brannan we would have to do so if we went that route. Okay, here's the map that I wanted to show you. And gosh, this is the route they're going to follow. Where they were, was east of Placerville, and they had gotten information that it was better to follow an Indian route over the Sierra than to go all the way back 80 miles before they hit the Truckee River and go up and go 27 times through the Truckee River Canyon. So it seems logical that the group sought information from anyone that they could about an alternate route. It is so logical that they chose to follow an Indian trail. Most early day wagon trails, as you all know, were Indian trails, then trapper trails, and then wagon trails. Most pioneers would have known this, so it is again logical that they would scout an existing wagon Indian trail. This proved to be a correct decision. This is Pleasant Valley, where that group assembled while they're waiting for their scouts to go. In the spring of 1848, a group of Mormons discharged Mormons from the battalion consisting of 45 men, 1 woman, 17 wagons, 2 brass cannons, along with 150 oxen and 150 horses and mules, assembled just east of Placerville in what Bigler called Pleasant Valley, and that still holds that name today. One member of the group went 6 miles up the trail to build a corral to hold the 300 animals while waiting to begin their journey. He told the others, "This place looks like a park." His name was James Sly, and that place holds, Sly Park holds that name today. This area, by the way, is where the Caldor fire is burning close to. Bigler wrote, July 5th, made an early start, still keeping to the divide. By 9 a.m. we rolled up to the front camp. Here they concluded to stop a few days. They found a nice little valley for our stock and send out men out to examine the route and look for the 3 of our company, Browett, Anderson, Cox, who had left camp that 25th of June to look out for a pass while the company was gathering. As yet they had not heard anything, and the camp began to feel uneasy. Accordingly, we sent out 10 men to look for them, while the rest of us took stock down to the little valley which we called Sly's Park after one of the men who had found it. They returned, the 10 returned on the 14th of July and reported that they had seen nothing of the 3 men, neither any signs after passing a certain point. They discovered a pass that would have to be worked. The group made slow progress into and making the ancient Indian trail wide enough for their wagons to pass through. They camped on a creek one of those nights that still has that name, Camp Creek, on it. On the 18th, they camped in a meadow with good water and wild onions growing. They named it Leak Springs, which still holds that name today. On July the 19th, Bigler wrote, we rolled out from Leak Springs and had hard, heavy pulling of the road over a snowbank. Mr. James Holmes' wagons broke down, making only 5 or 6 miles, and we camped on a spring near a fresh grave. Anyway, I'll continue. I think. Okay, where are we? We rolled out, and Mr. Holmes' wagon broke down, making only 5 or 6 miles, and we camped at a spring near a fresh grave. Determined to satisfy ourselves, it was soon open, and were shocked at the sight. There lay the 3 murdered men, robbed of every stitch of clothing, lying promiscuously in one hole about 2 feet deep. 2 of them were lying on their face. Allen was lying on his back, and appearance that an axe had been sunk into his face and had been shot in an eye. Blood still seemed oozing from the wounds. When we came to examining around about, we found arrows lying plentiful on the ground, many of them bloody and broken. Examining still closer, the rocks were stained with blood. Rocks were stained with blood. Mr. Allen's purse of gold dust lying about a rod from the grave, and gold was still in the sack. He had attached a buckskin string in sufficient length so as to put it over his head around his neck and letting the purse hang inside of his shirt. The 3 men were given a proper burial. We cut the following inscription on a balsam fir that stood near the grave: to the memory of Daniel Browett, Ezra Allen, Henderson Cock, who were supposed to have been murdered and buried by Indians on the night of the 27th of June, AD 1848. And we call this place Tragedy Spring. I have been studying this for 40 years, and it always created a lot of questions for me. And so I sat down and I wrote an article that will be published in the fall edition of the Overland Journal, detailing all of this related to this burial and this incident of these 3 Mormon men who were killed on the date we don't know. What's curious here is the date of June 27th, 1848. They weren't there to examine and write this until July the 19th. I'm not going to tell you what I speculate on that. You're going to have to read it in the OJ. How's that?
Thank you.
Bob Clark says thank you. On July 21st, the group left Tragedy Spring to continue. By the way, we had another tragedy at Tragedy Spring. In this past spring, we had 180-mile-an-hour winds that blew down heritage trees, and 2 of them broke the grave in half. That grave has since been restored, and it looks very much like it did, except for the trees that were blown over. And just recently, the Caldor fire burned over it. So Tragedy Springs tragedy continues. On June 21st, the group left Tragedy Springs to continue their journey. The next few days were going difficult. How am I doing here? I get to go over. Yeah, I got 5 minutes. I get to go over because of the technical difficulty. Right? Okay, there we go. Okay, this is an aerial view of the pass they finally summited before they dropped over on the east side. That's the trail. Right through there. This peak right here is called Melissa Corey Peak, and that was the one woman in the Mormon battalion. Remember when I said 45 men, 1 woman, 17 wagons? She's the first white woman to cross that summit at 9,600 feet, the highest point wagons ever would cross in the Gold Rush migration. Okay. This is what the trail looks like as you're going up towards West Pass and Melissa Corey Peak. The group continued on through onto the east side, and when they got on the east side, they dropped into a big valley that Bigler wrote, "We're now on the east side, and we have hope that we're going to make it, and we will name this valley Hope Valley," that still holds that name today. And then they continued on their journey. They went out following the Carson River route to about where Fallon is today, and then they made a northwest jog across the desert to hit the Truckee River route about where Wadsworth and turn east. To this day, I don't know how they knew to make that jog from the Carson River to the Truckee River. As they were going east, they ran into a mountain man by the name of James Kleiman. You'll remember James Kleiman. He was with Hastings the year before.
And he had 17 wagons. He was going over the Truckee River route. They showed him a map and a gold, and he followed the Carson River route. The next day, they met a mountain man by the name of Pierre Barlow Cornwall. He had 25 wagons. He was going to go they were going to go the Truckee River route, and they showed him the map, and he used the Carson River route. About 2 weeks later, they met Joseph Childs. Joseph Childs was with the Bidwell Bartleson Party in 1841, and he's coming with 45 wagons. And he was going to use the Truckee River route, and they showed him the map, and he brought his wagons. So we know in that first year of 1848, no less than 120 wagons, 120 people, wagons, and maybe 1,500 animals came over the Carson River route.